Hello everyone, my name is Petar Barlakovsky. I'm coming from Youth Educational Forum, which is a youth organization, and today I'll have the honor to talk about the EU civil society guidelines, which is something of a crucial importance to the civil society in the Western Balkans, but also in Turkey, and of course for the EU itself. Today in our podcast, our guest is Richard Allen, who is the team leader for the technical assistance to civil society organizations, also known as EU TACSO 3 in the Western Balkans in Turkey, which is an EU-funded project implemented by the consortium of GDSI Limited and LDK Consultants. Before I give the floor to my guest in this podcast, I would just like to brief you about the general info, what is and what are the EU civil society guidelines. So the DG NEAR guidelines for EU support to civil society in the enlargement region outline the results towards which EU support to civil society in the enlargement region will aspire in the period between 2021 to up until 2027. The EU support to civil society will continue to focus on strengthening participatory democracies and the EU approximation and integration processes in the Western Balkans and Turkey through a strengthened contribution by civil society. So I'll start with my first question here, Mr. Allen, and that is, why do you deem and see the civil society as something important, especially in developing countries such as ours?
Well, civil society is important everywhere. It's not just in this region, it's everywhere, if we want a functioning democracy. We know that governments are very powerful. We know business is very powerful. And it's very hard for citizens then to have a voice in, first of all, making decisions at government level, in making decisions about laws, but also then holding governments to account. And so civil society, by organising citizens together, enables citizens then to have a voice that is equal to the voices of business and government. Mm-hmm. And so any functioning democracy really has to have a good, strong, active and vibrant civil society in order to call themselves a democracy. And the EU, because the EU is a club of democracies, it's really important that the countries that aspire to become members of the EU have a strong civil society as part of their functioning democracy. And the EU will only admit new countries to be members if they do meet those criteria for membership, which include having a strong democracy.
So, as I said, today we're going to talk about the EU Civil Society Guidelines. So my question here would be, what are the EU Civil Society guidelines and what are they for?
Okay, well, the guidelines themselves are basically it's a set of standards, a set of objectives that spell out what we mean by a healthy civil society. Mm-hmm. The standards are actually rooted in different international law, different international standards, recommendations from organisations like the Council of Europe. And they basically say, look, this is what we mean by functioning in a strong civil society. I think up until now it's been very hard, especially for the EU, to say, okay, we want a country to join us as a member if they have a functioning civil society. But then the conversation kind of stops there, and you say, well, what do you mean by a civil society? And it's very hard to answer that meaningfully. So the guidelines are a way of actually bringing together all the different elements of what it means to be a functioning civil society. Mm-hmm. And using those, and using the indicators that are in the guidelines, we can actually measure the health of civil society. It's aimed at the countries of the Western Balkans and Turkey, but they can probably apply more widely than that.
So I'm sure a lot of colleagues from the civil society organization in the Western Balkans and also in Turkey would be really interested into what do these guidelines contain. Could you elaborate a bit more about these guidelines?
Sure. The guidelines are organised into three sections. The first section is about the enabling environment for civil society. And by enabling environment, we mean things like, citizens have a voice, they're not being silenced, they're able to assemble, they're able to group together, they're able to form organizations, and they have free speech. So this is the enabling environment, and they're not being silenced either overtly, but often we see in some of the countries in this region, and certainly in the world, we see countries where the environment for civil society is gradually being closed down, often through actions to silence media. You'll be very aware of that, but also to silence the availability of information, accurate information, the voices in formulating legislation, for holding government to account, and so on. If that's not there, that's the first part of the guidelines. If that's not there, you don't have a democracy. So the second part of the guidelines is around the cooperation between governments and civil society. And that really speaks to one really important thing, which is that government policy is much better when it's informed by the needs of citizens. Citizens need to be able to say, look, you're proposing this policy, you're proposing these laws, however, this is the impact on us, and we need to have a dialogue and discussion about that. Societies where there's a strong engagement between governments and civil society have much better legislation and much better policy. And so I think we need to encourage, and the standards set out some actions that governments can do to make sure that they listen to the voices of civil society, but also at the same time that civil society engages in discussion and dialogue. And that second part of the guidelines spells that out. The third part is about civil society itself. And I think that it's equally important that civil society organisations are transparent, are accountable. They hold themselves to high standards of governance and behaviour, and not just demand it from others. And so these guidelines are, this set of the guidelines really sets out some standards of expectation that we have of civil society organisations themselves. Now, none of these standards are new. They all exist in one form or another, and the EU guidelines then just bring them together into a single document that makes it relatively easy to say, okay, so this is what we expect. This is the mapping, if you like, of what we see in civil society.
So, although it says civil society guidelines, who should be aware of these civil society guidelines, and how can they use them?
Okay, I mean, I think there are three different audiences for the guidelines. I think the first is clearly governments of the region. By spelling out what the European Union means by a healthy civil society, governments can then say, okay, now we understand. Now our efforts, our strategies of development in cooperation with civil society can follow this guidance, and so it can really help governments say. Not only set out their strategies, but also measure their progress. So the feedback that they would get annually, because we'll be doing the assessment against the guidelines annually, and the feedback they get will actually help them measure the progress and see whether their strategies are working or not. So I think for the governments it's a really useful tool, and we've already seen governments actually taking notice of the guidelines and adapting them to their own strategic directions and policies. So that's the first audience. I think the second audience is civil society itself. Clearly, civil society organisations are also not perfect, and some of the work we're doing in researching against these guidelines, we're actually finding some quite fundamental issues about accountability and decision making that it would be great for civil society to reflect on and take into account and see actually how they can also function better and be more credible actors. I think it's really important that we see civil society organisations not as projects of donors, but as rooted in the communities, rooted in the constituencies of wherever they're functioning, and it's the people of their constituencies to whom they're accountable, and not the donors. And I think the guidelines spell out some of that dynamic, which I think is quite helpful. So that's the second audience. I think the third audience is then the EU itself and international donors who are supporting civil society. And it tells, in a way, it says, the EU is a huge supporter of civil society in this region. I mean, just for those 3 years, 2021, 2022, and 2023. There's a fund, the Civil Society Facility Fund, Civil Society Media, has something like 220 million euros approaching. And so it's a lot of money, and the guidelines are a way of helping them manage that funding and directing it. So by doing the research against the guidelines, we're able to highlight where things are working and where things are not working. And with that information, we can inform donors and say, look, these are the areas that in these countries, this is what we need to focus on because this is what's not working. Or this is really working and we can take this as an example and see if we can use it elsewhere. So I think those are the three main audiences.
So my final question would be, what happens next with these guidelines? What can we expect from them?
Okay, well, the first thing that happens, I mean, now we've launched them and they're out there, the next step is actually to do the first measurement. So at the moment, we're actually undertaking the exercise of researching the current situation in all of the 7 countries against each of the indicators to say, okay, and we'll be publishing a report probably early next year. The report will come out and it will set out the baseline conditions for against the guidelines. That baseline will then obviously, we'll repeat that exercise annually, and that will give us a sense of progress as well. And that evidence will then, as I said before, that evidence will inform the EU in terms of its funding practices. It will inform governments on their progress and in supporting civil society, and it will also inform civil society itself of what that change is. And it should, I mean, I'm sure there are going to be plenty of spin-off benefits as well that we can't predict at this point.
Mr. Allen, thank you very much for being here, for taking part in this podcast. It was really a pleasure for having you here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.